Hi, I'm Jim with Twisted Hobbies. Today, we're building the Veloxity.
Hello everybody and welcome to the build of the Veloxity and the Edge 540 XL. As you can see here, I've got my plane, I've got my power combo, I've got some foam tack, I've got a receiver, I've got everything I need. So I'm going to take out all the pieces, inventory everything, make sure I've got it all, and I'm going to fold over all of my surfaces. Just be careful because you don't want to pull this part over too far because it can crack the joint between the wing and the aileron. So I'm inventorying all of my carbon fiber pieces, and then we're going to start on the horizontal stabilizer and elevator. I couldn't find a couple of my carbon fiber pieces because they were in the parts bag. So once I sorted that, then I'm going to use some sandpaper and scuff up all of my carbon fiber pieces. This is optional, you don't really have to do it, but I think it gives some better grip with the CA glue. So I scratch them all up with some, I think I'm using some 150 sandpaper, and then I rub it down with rubbing alcohol, trying to keep any oils or anything off of any of the carbon fiber pieces. I put a piece of paper towel down to keep it clean because the stuff gets everywhere. You'll also notice as I start to do the dry fit on this that I do have a piece of parchment paper down. That's highly recommended. I put down the carbon fiber stiffeners into their slots, and then I go over it with some CA glue. I tend not to use kicker if I can avoid it, and you'll also see I'm using a little applicator bottle. I got those off of Amazon, and I like them because they don't clog up the applicator on the CA glue. Now we're moving on to the fuselage and the wings, and for this I use foam tack. On any foam to foam connections, I love using the foam tack, and I smear it on there real good and then pull it apart just a little bit to get some air into there, and then it'll tack up. Once it's nice and tacky, then you push it together and then it'll form a nice solid connection after that. I come back, push those together a few times. Now I'm ready to cut the spar for the wing, and to do this I'm going to start with the slot cutter tool from Twisted Hobbies. I'm using it at 6mm depth, and this thing just works like magic. We're not going from wingtip to wingtip, we're coming in just a little bit short of each side, and I just put my straight edge down and run this along the straight edge, and it cuts like magic. So I get the spar into place. It's a nice snug fit, and then I'm going to hit it with some CA all the way across. I'm using thin CA, and again, no kicker because the kicker tends to do some weird things with it once in a while, and so I try and avoid it. Working on the underside, same exact process. And the wing does have like a bit of a tip to it because it gets thinner towards the ends, so I do it in 2 steps, from the edge to the middle and then from the middle to the other edge. We push it down all the way across, we apply our CA glue, and I'm applying just enough to get it to wick all the way around. That's a nice close-up view of what the process looks like. And then I'm going to let this set and not touch it for a while because I don't want to move the plane around and possibly mess up the graphics or something like that with the CA glue that's on the top side. So while that's drying, I'm going to use some foam tack for the horizontal stabilizer and the elevator, and then we'll do the fuselage stiffeners as well. Sometimes these need a little bit of help to get all the way into their slot. You'll notice on this one I do run the X-Acto blade down that slot just a little bit more, and that's normal on these models because sometimes they just don't quite seat all the way in, so they need a little help. Refilling my little applicator bottle, and then we are ready to move on to some hardware for the landing gear. On these I tack them up a little bit, and then I come back and put a little bit more into the joint between those. And on these I did use a little bit of kicker because it's not on the foam. And those slide through the fuselage. Now I pull this off the edge of the table a little bit so that I can get the motor mount put in. I'm taking some extra care to put in a lot of CA in this area because we want to make sure to get both in front and behind the motor mount. And keep in mind, we're only doing the glue on the motor mount for the fuselage. When we do the vertical fuselage on the top and bottom, we have to put glue on those too. Here you see me putting in these stiffeners that go from the gear reinforcement area up to the motor mount. And I only did these on the bottom of the plane. I forgot to do them on the top until much later. You'll see when I am able to get to those. But they go through those slots all the way up to the motor mount. Now I am going to the hardware kit. You'll notice my hardware is all black. I did hit those with some spray paint because I really like the look of the black. Now we're doing the bottom of the vertical fuselage, and I'm putting foam tack all along that seam. I use the foam tack for any foam to foam connections and CA glue for hardware for the most part. There is a link to the video in the description where I go over all of the tools and supplies that I use for building. Pushing it into place, making sure it's at 90 degrees using my little square that I have. You can get that from Twisted Hobbies as well. And then you see all of my control horns, and we're going to be assembling the push rods for the ailerons. So I dress those up a little bit and put the brass pieces that are threaded onto the ends of the push rods. And once those are glued, I also crimp them a little bit. Then we're going to put on the ball ends, and I just hold on to it and twist them on until they're about halfway in. I use a piece of carbon fiber, a small piece, to put through the ball end so that way I can twist it. And on this, they want these at 71 millimeters in length. So I trim them to length. Then I scuff up the ends of them, and then we're going to install the ball ends at exactly 78 millimeters between the ends. Glue those in place. And then we're going to move on to the control horn extensions. So I get those edges all sanded up. You'll notice I painted these black as well. Not really necessary, but I like to do it. Then I get the control horns out of the servo packs, and then we're going to glue these together. Now I'm going to do these in a couple different ways and here I am reaming out one of the ends so that I can fit the stock servo horn into the extender. I'm going to do these in two different ways. One of them, I'm going to use some thread and CA glue to secure it, and on the other, I'm just going to drill a hole and use a little bit of a screw from a servo. Here's the two ways it's going to end up looking. I don't think one is necessarily better than another, so I just want to show both ways. So first I start this with a little pin vise to get the hole through the servo horn and extension, and then I'm just going to use a small screw, place it through both of them, and then snip it off. I put CA glue all the way around, and then that one's done. On this one, I'm going to just wrap it with some thread and then glue it all into place. And then once those are all glued together and finished up, we're going to start on the aileron control horns. I'm just going to sand those up a little bit to get them scuffed up and ready to insert. And I need to center my servos. So in order to do that, I hook up all the electronics. I've got the battery, the ESC, the receiver, and my transmitter. And I put that all together. I calibrate the ESC. I get all that taken care of. I have a whole video on that if you're interested. That's also in the description. But the big thing was getting those servos centered, so that way when I put them together and glue them into the wing, they are in the correct position. So I made sure that they were ready to go. I had gotten a little bit of glue stuck into it that I had to clear out, so I cleared that out. Now I'm going to mount the push rods to the servo horn extensions, and it should look a little something like this in the photo. So I get that done on both of them, and then we're going to test fit those into the wings, and we're going to put the aileron control horns into the assembly as well. That way we'll be able to cut the slots for the aileron control horns in the perfect place. Once I get those screwed into place, we're going to be cutting the slots for the servos and then positioning the control horns and cutting the slots for those as well. And to get those in the right place, I kind of get them where they should go, push them down, it gives a little impression, and then you're able to cut the slots for the tabs on the servos, and it should look something like this. Then I'm going to cut the slots for the control horns on the ailerons, and I just put them into place and then run the blade along it, push them in, and glue those with some CA glue. Then I'm going to switch over to some foam tack and use that to glue in the servos themselves. I use foam tack because if I do need to remove them later, it's a lot easier to get them out. Next, I was going to do the servo horn extensions for the elevator and the rudder, but then I realized that the servo horns that come in the bag for my servos were the exact same length as the extenders, so I just skipped that step and put those aside. Next, we're going to move on to the push rods for the rudder and the elevator, and same process used here as the push rods for the ailerons. I'm going to get the little brass piece on, screw on the ball link, and for the elevator I am making it so that it's exactly 150 millimeters between the middle of the ball link on each end. And when I get to the rudder, I'll be doing that at 169 millimeters because I'm making the Veloxity here. If you're making the Edge, just make sure you check the manual, but it is at 185 millimeters on the rudder. Now with the push rods done, we can move on to the elevator. I'm putting in the horn for the elevator and then cutting the slot open a little bit for the servo. Get it put into the right place, get the wires run, maybe make sure I put my servo horn on there, and then getting the push rod attached, and then the control horn glued into place. Now we can glue the canopy on to our fuselage, and then we're going to glue the upper fuselage onto the plane. Make sure you put lots of glue on this area because if you're going to be grabbing the plane out of the air, then this is where you're probably going to be grabbing it by. And then I'm going to install the servo. Again, cutting the slot so that the tabs fit in. Installing the horn onto the servo. And then dry fitting the vertical fuselage. Everything there looks good. I like to set this down right next to it so you can see where the tabs are. So as you're applying glue, you're making sure it's in the right spot. And then we get that glued into place. I'm using my little square there to make sure everything's square. Also make sure you're putting glue up on your motor mount because you don't want to forget that area. Next up is going to be the tail skid and the rudder reinforcement pieces. So first I glue the fiberglass piece into the tail skid, and then the reinforcement pieces go in, and then the rudder itself. I also chose to reinforce this tail skid area a little bit after I'd built the plane. I had a couple landings where I came in and it pulled the rudder hinge apart, so I put in a piece of 3mm carbon fiber rod that I had, and I was able to reinforce this area so that way coming in for the landings, if I didn't make it quite perfect, then it would have a little more protection for the rudder. And then once we've attached that final push rod for the rudder, we are ready to get started onto the landing gear. First thing we need to do is drill a hole through it, and I use my digital calipers in order to find the width of it, and then I just divide that by 2 and put a little scratch in from each side. That way it finds the middle really nicely. I use my pin vise to get this started. I go with a pretty small drill bit and then work my way up. So I went up in size. I used an actual drill on it to finish it up. Then we're going to feed the gear through the plane, apply these brackets that are going to hold it in place, screw those all the way through, and then we'll assemble the wheels and wheel pants. I used a drill on the wheels to open up inside of them. You want to make sure that they're freely rotating around their little axles. And then I got it all set up. Here's what the assembly is going to look like when we're all done. And here are all the components laid out in the order that they go in. And I find that if you have a 5.5 socket and a 2.5 Allen, then it makes this whole process way easier to work with. Some people forego installing the pants on these and only install the wheels. It really depends on your runway. If you have a very tall grassy runway, then these are going to get caught and have some issues. Now we're going to be moving on to the side force generators. They're going to require 2 of the stiffeners each, and as I was doing those, I was like, hey, what are these extra stiffeners doing? These are the ones I mentioned earlier. They go between the motor mount and the landing gear, and they fit right into place, and then just put them in with some CA. I could have probably done this at an earlier step, but this was also an acceptable place to do it. Now we're ready to start on the side force generators. Once they're dry fit, we just get the glue in and then get those into place. Sorry, that's a little bit out of frame. Next, we're going to be working on installing the electronics. But in order to do that, I drove these screws in and then pulled them back out, put some CA glue into there to reinforce it a little bit. And then once that's dry, then we're able to actually install the motor after that. That just gives a little bit more reinforcement on the motor mount, and so you don't pull those screws out. The motor goes into place, the ESC goes into place. I'm also putting my receiver in there. I'm cutting a little slot for the aileron servos for their wire to go all the way back. And then I'm also cutting a little slot for the plug. I really like this to be a plug that I can plug in the battery from the top of the plane, but this isn't a requirement. Once I get all the wires routed, I'm going to glue them into place. Then I'll put on the propeller, check my center of gravity with a battery on there, and then I am good to go to fly this plane. And this is going to be the final install on the electronics, how it's laid out, and then also where I cut my slot. I'm using a 3S2200, and there's the plug that I put all the way through. Let's take a look at the maiden flight. Okay, for this maiden flight, what I'm looking for is to make sure that the plane is reacting how I would expect it to. I'm also looking for any trim issues, anything that I need to go back and adjust the linkages on or anything like that. Before I pulled it off the ground, you make sure that the servos are headed in the right direction and right aileron goes right, left aileron goes left, all that stuff. But here we're looking for center of gravity and anything that's weird, looking for anything that could have gone wrong during the build process, but this plane has been flying great. For the center of gravity on this flight, I just have the battery attached with a Velcro strap temporarily, so that way I can do some tweaks. The manual is a great starting place. They want the center of gravity 275 millimeters back from the front of the fuselage. If you are building the edge, then you're going to be at 265 millimeters back. Then you tweak it as you need to depending on what batteries you're using, and then you find a good spot that you really like it. So I've done 20 flights on this plane since this maiden flight, and it really excels in the wind. It does great at holding everything steady. It hovers well. It does everything really well. It does a lot of the high energy stuff that some of the other foamies can't quite do, and it's a powerhouse. It really rips around. So I hope that you enjoy flying this plane as much as I do. I hope you enjoyed the build, and I hope that the video helped you out a little bit. So I'll see you on the next build.